The dust cloud rose like smoke signals on the horizon, and Victoria Osborne realized with mounting horror that the wagon train was disappearing into the distance without her. She had stepped away from camp for just a few minutes that morning, seeking privacy behind a cluster of rocks while the rest of the travelers prepared to depart. The sun had barely crested the mountains of western Colorado, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when she heard the crack of whips and the groaning protest of wooden wheels beginning their daily journey. Victoria had hurried back, her skirts gathered in her hands as she ran, but the trainmaster had apparently not bothered with a head count. By the time she crested the small hill that had hidden her from view, the entire procession was already a quarter-mile ahead, moving steadily westward. She called out, her voice breaking with panic, but the wind carried her cries in the wrong direction. Victoria ran after them, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air, her boots kicking up small stones that bruised her feet through the worn leather. She ran until her legs trembled and threatened to give out, until the wagon train became nothing more than a smudge against the landscape, until finally she collapsed to her knees in the middle of the rutted trail, gasping for breath. The September morning held a sharp chill, and Victoria wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as reality settled over her like a shroud. She was alone in the Colorado wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small cloth bag containing a handkerchief and a few hairpins. Her trunk with all her possessions, her money, her food, everything she owned in the world was on that disappearing wagon train. She was 3 days out from Telluride, the mining town where she had planned to start a new life as a school teacher, far away from the scandals and whispers that had followed her in Ohio after her father's business collapsed and her engagement had been broken. Victoria stood on shaking legs and looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding her. Mountains rose on either side of the valley, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Pine trees clustered in dark patches on the slopes, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the rush of water. The trail stretched before and behind her, nothing but packed earth marked by countless wheels and hooves. She had never felt so small, so utterly insignificant and forgotten. She began walking, following the wagon tracks westward because there was nothing else to do. Perhaps if she walked long enough, fast enough, she might catch up when they stopped for their midday rest. But as the sun climbed higher and the hours passed, Victoria knew she was fooling herself. The wagons could cover ground far faster than her tired feet could carry her. Still, she kept moving, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and defeat in this wilderness meant death. By afternoon, Victoria's throat was parched and her lips had begun to crack. She had not thought to bring water in her rush that morning, and now the lack of it was becoming desperate. Her head pounded with each step, and black spots occasionally danced at the edges of her vision. When she finally heard the sound of a creek, she nearly wept with relief. She stumbled off the trail and down a small embankment, falling to her knees beside the clear water and drinking deeply, not caring that she was soaking the front of her dress. The cold water revived her somewhat, but it also made her aware of how hungry she was. She had eaten only a small biscuit before dawn, and her stomach now cramped with emptiness. Victoria sat beside the creek and tried to think clearly. She could continue following the trail, hoping against hope that the wagon train would notice her absence and send someone back. She could try to make it to Telluride on her own, though she had no idea how far it actually was or if she could survive the journey without supplies. Or she could try to backtrack to the last town they had passed through, which had been at least 2 days behind them. Every option seemed impossible. She was still sitting there, numb with despair and exhaustion, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Victoria scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering with sudden fear. She had heard stories around the campfires at night about bandits and outlaws who preyed on travelers, about the lawlessness of these mountain regions where gold and silver had drawn men of every stripe, both honorable and corrupt. She pressed herself behind a large boulder, holding her breath as the rider came closer. Through a gap in the rock, she could see him. He sat tall in the saddle atop a dark bay horse, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim pants, and a leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and a gun belt hung at his hip. As he drew even with the creek, he suddenly pulled his horse to a stop and looked directly at her hiding place. "I know you are there," he called out, his voice deep and steady. "I saw your footprints leaving the trail. If you are in trouble, I mean you no harm. If you are trying to rob me, I should tell you I have very little worth taking and a very good aim." Victoria hesitated for a long moment before stepping out from behind the boulder. What choice did she have? She could not hide forever, and if this man meant to harm her, he would find her eventually anyway. Better to face him now while she still had some strength left. He pulled off his hat when he saw her, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was tanned and weathered, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, and there was something solid and dependable in the way he sat his horse, taking in her disheveled appearance with a concerned expression. "Miss, are you hurt?" he asked, swinging down from the saddle with an easy grace. "No," Victoria said, and her voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "No, I am not hurt. I am lost. The wagon train I was traveling with left without me this morning, and I cannot catch up to them." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "They left you behind? Just abandoned you out here?" "I do not think it was intentional," Victoria said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. She had kept to herself during the journey, grieving the life she had left behind and not interested in forming connections with people she would likely never see again. It was possible no one had noticed her absence at all. "I stepped away for a moment, and when I returned, they were already moving. I tried to call out, but no one heard me." The cowboy shook his head, his jaw tightening with what looked like anger. That train master should have done a count before pulling out. That is basic safety. You could have died out here. "I still might," Victoria said, and suddenly the enormity of her situation crashed over her again. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink back, but they spilled down her cheeks anyway. "Everything I own was on that train. My money, my clothes, my teaching certificate. I was going to Telluride to be a school teacher. I was going to start over, and now I have nothing. I am nothing." She turned away from him, mortified to be crying in front of a stranger, but her composure had finally shattered after the terrible day. She heard him move closer, his boots crunching on the rocky ground, and then his voice came again, gentler this time. "You are not nothing. You are alive, and that is what matters most." He paused, and she heard him take a breath. "My name is Mason Young. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of here, up in the high valley. It is not fancy, but it is solid and safe. You are welcome to come there, rest, get some food in you, then we can figure out what to do next." Victoria turned back to face him, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I cannot pay you. I told you, I have nothing." "I did not ask for payment," Mason said simply. "It is what anyone decent would do." She studied his face, looking for any sign of ulterior motives or danger, but she saw only honest concern and a quiet strength that made her want to trust him. And really, what choice did she have? She could not survive out here alone, and this man was offering her a lifeline. "My name is Victoria Osborne," she said finally, "and I would be grateful for your help." Mason nodded and moved to his horse, taking a canteen from his saddle. "Here, drink some more water. Then we will get you up on Thunder here, and we will head to the ranch. Can you ride?" "I can manage," Victoria said, taking the canteen and drinking gratefully. The water was tepid but tasted better than anything she could remember. Mason helped her onto the horse, and she was acutely aware of his hands at her waist, strong and sure as he lifted her into the saddle as though she weighed nothing. Then he swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins, and Victoria found herself pressed back against his chest. His arms on either side of her. It was shockingly intimate, and she felt her face flush with heat despite the cool mountain air. "Hold on," Mason said. And then they were moving, leaving the trail behind and heading north across open grassland. The ride took less than an hour, but Victoria would remember every minute of it for the rest of her life. The steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, the warmth of Mason's body at her back, the way he occasionally pointed out landmarks and told her their names in that deep, calm voice. He showed her Eagle Peak to the west and Copper Creek that ran through his property, and the old lightning-struck pine that marked the boundary of his land. He talked to fill the silence, she thought, to keep her from dwelling on the disaster of her situation, and she was grateful for it. The ranch came into view as they crested a rise, and Victoria felt something loosen in her chest. It was not large or elaborate, just a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, and a few outbuildings, all nestled in a meadow surrounded by pine-covered hills. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see horses in a corral near the barn, their coats gleaming in the afternoon light. It looked like the kind of place where a person could catch their breath, could feel safe. "It is not much," Mason said, and she could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice, as though her opinion mattered to him. "It is beautiful," Victoria said honestly, and she felt him relax slightly behind her. He rode up to the cabin and dismounted, then reached up to help her down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, exhausted from the long day and the emotional toll, but Mason's hand steadied her. "Easy," he said. "Let us get you inside and sitting down." The interior of the cabin was as solid and practical as the exterior. One large room served as kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough-hewn table and chairs in the center. A ladder led up to a loft space, and 2 doors on the back wall presumably led to other rooms. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though clearly the home of a bachelor. There were no curtains on the windows, no decorative touches, just the bare necessities arranged with military precision. Mason guided her to a chair at the table and then moved to the fireplace where a pot hung over the low flames. "I made stew this morning before I left. It should still be good. Let me get you some." Victoria watched as he ladled thick stew into a bowl and set it before her with a spoon and a hunk of bread. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to not gulp it down like an animal. The stew was simple but good, heavy with meat and vegetables and rich broth, and the bread was slightly stale but edible. She cleaned the bowl without realizing it and looked up to find Mason watching her with a small smile. "Better?" he asked. "Much better," Victoria admitted. "Thank you. I did not realize how hungry I was." "You have had a rough day." Mason poured coffee from a pot on the stove and set a cup in front of her, then took a seat across the table with his own cup. "Tell me about this teaching position in Telluride. Were they expecting you at a certain time?" "I was supposed to arrive by the end of the week," Victoria said. "The school term starts in 2 weeks, and I was to have time to prepare the classroom and find lodgings. But now—" She trailed off helplessly. "Now you have no way to prove who you are or why you are there, since your certificate was on that train," Mason finished. He drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "Telluride is about 3 days from here by wagon, less on horseback if you push hard. I could take you there, help you explain the situation. The school board might be willing to wire back to Ohio to verify your credentials." "That could take weeks," Victoria said. "They will not hold the position for me that long. They will hire someone else." Mason was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Then you will find something else. Telluride is a boom town right now with the silver mines going strong. There is plenty of work for anyone willing to do it. You could work in one of the boarding houses or a shop or a restaurant. You would survive." Victoria set down her coffee cup with more force than she intended. "I do not want to just survive. I want to teach. I spent 2 years at normal school training for this. I am good at it. Back in Ohio, I taught at the primary school for a year before everything fell apart and the children learned. Truly learned. I made a difference." Her voice broke slightly. "I need to make a difference somewhere. I need to matter." Mason reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, his touch gentle. "You matter, Victoria. You matter whether you are teaching or not. Your worth does not come from what you do. It comes from who you are." She looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes, by the conviction in his voice. This man who had known her for only a few hours was looking at her as though she was someone precious, someone worth saving. It made her chest tight and her eyes sting with fresh tears. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know you are brave," Mason said. "You did not fall apart when you found yourself abandoned. You kept walking, kept trying to survive. I know you are educated and determined. I know you cry when you are overwhelmed, but you do not let it stop you. That is enough for me to know you are worth helping." Victoria turned her hand over beneath his, lacing their fingers together without quite meaning to. She should pull away, should maintain some propriety, but she could not make herself do it. His hand felt like an anchor in a storm, solid and sure, and she desperately needed something to hold on to. "I do not know what to do next," she admitted. "Tonight you rest," Mason said. "You can have my room. I will sleep in the loft. Tomorrow we will figure out a plan. Maybe we can catch up to that wagon train if we ride fast, or maybe we find another solution, but right now you need to sleep." He was right. Now that she had food in her stomach and the immediate crisis had passed, exhaustion was crashing over her in waves. She could barely keep her eyes open. Mason led her to one of the back rooms, which held a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a wooden chest. "There are clean blankets in the chest if you need them," he said, "and water in the pitcher for washing. If you need anything in the night, just call out. I am a light sleeper." "Thank you," Victoria said, "for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay kindness, Rodolnas," Mason said. "That is not how it works." He closed the door softly behind him, and Victoria sank onto the edge of the bed, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She should wash her face, should at least remove her boots, but instead she simply fell sideways onto the mattress and was asleep within seconds. She woke once in the deep of night, disoriented and frightened until she remembered where she was. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mason moving around quietly, tending the fire perhaps, or checking on the horses. The sounds were domestic and comforting, and she drifted back to sleep feeling safer than she had in months. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Victoria sat up slowly, her body stiff from the previous day's ordeal, and made use of the water in the pitcher to wash her face and hands. She did what she could with her hair, repinning it as neatly as possible without a mirror, and then went out to face the new day. Mason was at the stove, tending a skillet. He looked over his shoulder when she emerged and smiled. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Victoria admitted. "I did not realize how tired I was." "Traveling by wagon train is exhausting even when you do not get abandoned," Mason said. He scooped eggs and bacon onto 2 plates and brought them to the table. "Sit, eat. We have a lot to discuss." Over breakfast, they talked through her options. Mason had been thinking about her situation all night, he told her, and he had an idea. His nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, lived about 10 miles east. They had 6 children. And Mrs. Patterson had mentioned more than once that she wished she could provide them with proper schooling beyond what she could teach them herself. If Victoria was willing, Mason could take her there, introduce her, and see if Mrs. Patterson might be interested in hiring her as a private tutor for the children. It would not be a public school position, but it would be teaching, and it would give her time to figure out her next steps. "The Pattersons are good people," Mason said. "They would treat you well and pay you fairly, and if it does not work out, at least you would have earned some money and have a safe place to stay while you make other plans." It was not what Victoria had envisioned for her new life, but it was a lifeline, and she was in no position to refuse. "I would be grateful for the introduction," she said. "Good." Mason stood and began clearing the dishes. "We will ride over there today if you're feeling up to it. The sooner we get you settled somewhere, the better." They set out after Mason had finished his morning chores. He saddled a gentle mare named Daisy for Victoria to ride, and she found that she could manage the horse without too much difficulty. Her seat was not elegant, but it was functional, and that was all that mattered out here. They rode east across rolling grassland, following a faint trail that Mason seemed to know by instinct. The day was bright and clear, with that crystalline quality that mountain air has in autumn. Victoria found herself noticing details she had been too distraught to see the day before. The way the aspens growing along the creeks were beginning to turn gold. The cry of a hawk circling overhead, the smell of pine and sage carried on the breeze. Mason rode slightly ahead, occasionally turning to check on her, and she caught herself watching him more than the landscape. There was something compelling about the way he moved with his horse, completely at ease, as though he and the animal were a single creature. He belonged here in a way she had never belonged anywhere. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, spurring her horse forward to ride alongside him. 3 years, Mason said. "I worked as a drover for a while, helping move cattle from Texas up to the railheads in Kansas. Saved every penny I could. When I had enough, I came out here and filed a claim on that land. Built the cabin with my own hands, bought some horses and a few head of cattle. It is not a big operation, but it is mine. No one can take it away from me." There was fierce pride in his voice. And something else too, something that sounded like old pain. "Did someone try to take something from you before?" Victoria asked gently. Mason was quiet for a long moment. "My family had a farm in Missouri when I was growing up. Good land. Worked it for generations. Then the war came and everything fell apart. Bushwhackers burned us out in '63, killed my father and brother. My mother died of fever that winter. I was 15. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "I swore then that when I got my own place, it would be somewhere remote, somewhere I could see trouble coming from miles away, somewhere I could defend." "I am sorry," Victoria said, her heart aching for the boy he had been, orphaned and alone. "That is a terrible thing to survive." "Everyone out here has lost something," Mason said. "That is why most folks come west, to escape what was, to try to build something new. I imagine that is true for you too." Victoria nodded slowly. "My father owned a dry goods store in Cleveland. It was successful, respectable. I was engaged to the son of another merchant, a man named Charles. Everything was planned out for my future. Then my father made some bad investments, tried to cover the losses by borrowing money he could not repay. The store failed, and he died of a heart attack 2 weeks later. The debt collectors took everything, even my mother's jewelry. Charles broke our engagement immediately. Said he could not afford to marry into a family with that kind of scandal attached." She took a breath. "My mother went to live with her sister in Pittsburgh. I applied for teaching positions as far from Ohio as possible. Telluride seemed like a good place to disappear." "You are not disappearing," Mason said firmly. "You are starting over. There is a difference." "Is there?" Victoria asked. "Yes." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "Disappearing is about running away from something. Starting over is about running towards something. Which one are you doing?" Victoria thought about that as they rode. Which was she doing? She had been so focused on escaping the whispers and pitying looks, on getting away from the wreckage of her old life, that she had not really thought about what she was running toward. What did she want, truly? To teach, yes, but that was just an action. What did she want her life to be? "I want to matter," she said finally. "I want to be part of a community, to have friends, to make a difference in people's lives. I was so isolated in Cleveland after my father died. Everyone who had been our friends just vanished. They did not want to be associated with the scandal. I felt like a ghost, already dead, but still walking around. I want to feel alive again." "Then that is what we will work toward," Mason said. "The Pattersons are good people, and they are part of a small community of ranchers in this area. If they take you on, you will have a place. You will matter." They reached the Patterson ranch just after noon. It was larger than Mason's spread, with a proper house instead of a cabin, a big barn, and multiple corrals. Children of various ages were scattered around the yard, and they all came running when they saw Mason approach. He clearly knew them well. greeting each by name and asking after their activities with genuine interest. A woman emerged from the house wiping her hands on her apron, her face lighting up with a smile. "Mason Young, as I live and breathe, we have not seen you in a month. I was beginning to think you had forgotten us." She was a handsome woman in her 40s with laugh lines around her eyes and capable hands. Her gaze moved to Victoria with frank curiosity. "And who is this?" Mason dismounted and helped Victoria down. "Sarah, this is Miss Victoria Osborne. She was traveling to Telluride on a wagon train when they accidentally left her behind yesterday. I found her on the trail and brought her to my place for the night. Victoria is a trained school teacher, and I remembered you saying you wished your children could have proper schooling. I thought the two of you should meet." Sarah Patterson's eyes widened. "A school teacher? Truly?" She looked Victoria up and down, taking in her dusty, rumpled dress and disheveled hair, but her expression was kind. "Well, any friend of Mason's is welcome here. Come inside and let me get you something to drink. We can talk." The interior of the Patterson house was warm and chaotic, with children's belongings scattered everywhere and the smell of baking bread filling the air. Sarah shooed her children outside so the adults could talk in peace, and then she sat Victoria and Mason down at a large kitchen table and poured cool cider for everyone. Victoria explained her situation as clearly as she could, leaving out the worst of the scandal back in Ohio, but being honest about losing all her possessions and credentials with the wagon train. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking questions, her expression thoughtful. "I have 6 children," Sarah said when Victoria finished. "The oldest is 14, the youngest is 7. My husband Thomas and I do what we can to teach them reading and arithmetic, but neither of us had much schooling ourselves. I worry they will not have the opportunities they deserve without proper education." She paused, considering. "If you are willing to teach them, I would be happy to provide you with room and board, plus $20 a month. We have a room off the kitchen that is not being used. It is small, but it is private. You would take meals with the family. Does that sound acceptable?" $20 a month was not a fortune, but it was fair pay for this time and place, and room and board meant she would not have to spend anything on necessities. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. "That sounds more than acceptable. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I promise I will work hard. Your children will learn." "I believe you," Sarah said warmly. She reached across the table and squeezed Victoria's hand. "And please call me Sarah. We do not stand on formality much out here. When can you start?" "Immediately, if you like," Victoria said. "I have nothing to pack or prepare." Sarah laughed. "Well then, that makes things easy. Mason, will you stay for dinner? It is the least we can do to thank you for bringing Victoria to us." "I appreciate the offer," Mason said, and Victoria thought she heard reluctance in his voice. "But I need to get back to the ranch before dark. I have been gone too long already." He stood to leave, and Victoria felt sudden panic rise in her chest. He was going, and she might never see him again. This man who had saved her life, who had treated her with such kindness and respect, was about to ride out of her life as quickly as he had entered it. She stood quickly, nearly knocking over her chair. "Mason, wait," she said. "I did not properly thank you. If you had not found me yesterday, I do not know what would have happened to me. You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," Mason said, but his eyes were soft as he looked at her. "No," Victoria said firmly. "Not everyone. Most people would have left me there, or worse. You went out of your way to help someone you did not know and had no reason to trust. That is not common decency. That is exceptional character." Mason ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I am glad you will be safe here with the Pattersons. They are good people. Sarah, Thomas, thank you for taking her in." Sarah walked him to the door while Victoria stood frozen by the table, her heart hammering. Was this really it? Was she really going to let him leave without saying something? Without acknowledging the strange connection she had felt between them from almost the first moment? It was absurd. She had known him for less than 24 hours. She could not possibly have feelings for him. It must just be gratitude, or the emotional intensity of her situation, or loneliness. But when he paused at the door and looked back at her, when their eyes met across the room, Victoria knew it was more than that. The air between them seemed to thicken and charge, and she saw in his face that he felt it too, this inexplicable pull, this sense of recognition, as though they had known each other for years instead of hours, as though they were meant to find each other on that dusty trail. "Goodbye, Victoria," Mason said quietly. "I hope your new life brings you everything you are looking for." Then he was gone, and Victoria sank back into her chair, feeling as though something vital had just walked out the door. The weeks that followed fell into a steady rhythm that was both comforting and strange. Victoria threw herself into teaching the Patterson children, setting up a proper classroom in one corner of the big parlor and establishing a daily schedule. The children were eager and bright, hungry for knowledge, and she found joy in watching their minds open to new ideas. She taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, history and natural science. She made lessons out of everything around them, using the ranch animals to teach biology, the constellations to teach navigation, the formation of the mountains to teach geology. Sarah became a friend as well as an employer, often sitting with Victoria in the evenings to do needlework and talk. Thomas Patterson was a quiet man, hard-working and kind, who clearly adored his wife and children. The other ranch families in the area began to hear about the new school teacher, and several asked if she might take on their children as well. Within a month, Victoria was teaching 12 students of various ages, and the Pattersons had converted their barn loft into a proper schoolroom. She should have been happy. She was doing exactly what she had trained for, making a difference in these children's lives, becoming part of a community. The Pattersons treated her like family, and the other ranch families were welcoming and kind. She had everything she had told Mason she wanted, but she was not happy. Or rather, she was content but not fulfilled, satisfied but not complete. Because every day, multiple times a day, she found herself thinking about Mason Young, wondering what he was doing, whether he was safe, whether he ever thought about her. She told herself it was ridiculous that she barely knew him, that she should focus on the good life she was building here. But logic had nothing to do with the way her heart jumped every time she saw a rider approaching in the distance, hoping it might be him. The way she found excuses to ask Thomas or Sarah about him when they happened to mention their neighbor to the west. The way she lay awake at night remembering the feeling of riding with him, his arms around her, his voice low in her ear. 6 weeks after Mason had brought her to the Pattersons, Thomas came in from town with supplies and news. "Saw Mason Young in Placerville," he said as Sarah helped him unload the wagon. "He asked after you, Victoria, wanted to know how you were settling in." Victoria's hand stilled on the jar of preserves she had been carrying to the pantry. "What did you tell him?" "Told him you were doing wonderfully, that the children adore you and you have become part of the family. He seemed pleased." Thomas paused, then added carefully, "He looked tired, though. Thin. I think he's been working himself too hard getting ready for winter without any help. I invited him to come to our barn raising next month. Told him we would all pitch in to help him get his stock barn finished before the snow comes. He seemed surprised anyone would offer." "That man keeps too much to himself," Sarah said, shaking her head. "He has been out here 3 years and still acts like he does not deserve friends or help. Someone needs to knock some sense into him." Victoria thought about that conversation for days afterward. She imagined Mason alone at his ranch, working from dawn to dusk with no one to talk to, no one to share meals with, no one to ease the loneliness. It made her chest ache. He had shown her such kindness, had saved her life, and now he was struggling while she was safe and comfortable. It did not seem right. The barn raising was scheduled for a Saturday in late October. All the nearby families would gather at the Patterson ranch and then travel together to Mason's place to help him finish construction on a larger barn for his growing herd. Sarah spent days preparing food for the event, and the children were excited about the party atmosphere of such gatherings. Victoria told herself she should stay behind, that her presence would serve no purpose, but Sarah would not hear of it. "You are part of this community now," Sarah said firmly. "Everyone comes to barn raisings. Besides, Mason specifically asked if you would be there when Thomas last saw him." "He did?" Victoria tried to keep her voice neutral, but she knew she failed when Sarah smiled knowingly. He did. So you will come, and you will bring that apple cake you make so well, and you will stop pretending you do not think about that man constantly. Victoria felt her face flame red. I barely know him. Sometimes knowing happens fast, Sarah said gently. Thomas and I met on a Wednesday and were married the following Saturday. When you know, you know. The question is whether you are brave enough to do something about it. The morning of the barn raising dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass. Victoria dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep blue wool that Sarah had altered to fit her. It was not new or particularly fashionable, but it was clean and neat, and it brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged her hair 3 times before she was satisfied, then felt foolish for caring so much. This was a work party, not a social event. Everyone would be covered in sawdust and sweat within an hour. The journey to Mason's ranch seemed to take forever, though they covered the distance in under 2 hours. Victoria rode in the wagon with Sarah and the younger children, while Thomas and the older boys rode ahead with tools and materials. Other families joined them along the way until there was a whole procession of wagons and riders heading toward Mason's valley. Mason was waiting in his yard when they arrived, and Victoria's breath caught at the sight of him. Thomas had been right. He looked thinner, more worn, but he also looked genuinely pleased to see everyone. He greeted each family by name, shaking hands and thanking them for coming, his natural reserve softening in the warmth of community. When he reached the Patterson wagon and his eyes found Victoria, he went very still. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Victoria felt that same electric connection she had felt the day he rode away. 6 weeks had not diminished it at all. If anything, it was stronger, more urgent, as though her whole body was crying out in recognition. "Miss Osborne," Mason said, his voice slightly rough, "it is good to see you. I hope you have been well." "Very well, thank you," Victoria managed. "The Pattersons have been wonderful, and the children are excellent students. I have been fortunate." "I am glad," Mason said, and something in his eyes told her he meant more than just the words conveyed. Then the work began, and there was no more time for conversation. The men organized themselves into teams, some working on the frame, others on the walls, still others preparing materials. The women set up cooking areas and began preparing the midday meal while children ran wild in the yard, freed from their usual chores and schoolwork. Victoria found herself working alongside Sarah and the other ranch wives, cutting vegetables and frying chicken and setting up tables. But all morning she was aware of exactly where Mason was, what he was doing, even when she could not see him. It was as though her body had developed a 6th sense tuned specifically to him, and whenever she did glance his way, more often than not, she found him looking at her too before he quickly turned back to his work. By midday, the barn frame was up and the walls were beginning to take shape. Everyone broke for lunch, gathering around the tables that had been set up in Mason's yard. There was a festive atmosphere, with people laughing and talking, children playing tag between the adults, dogs barking and begging for scraps. Victoria found herself sitting between Sarah and another ranch wife, listening to them gossip about happenings in the area. But her attention kept drifting to where Mason sat with Thomas and the other men. He looked happy, she realized. Tired and sweaty from the hard work, but genuinely happy in a way she had not seen him before. He belonged here too, she thought. He had built this place with his own hands, had carved out a life for himself from nothing, but he had not let himself be truly part of the community around him. Today, watching him laugh at something Thomas said, seeing the way the other men included him and respected him, Victoria understood that Mason had been as lonely as she had been. They were both people who had lost everything and had been trying to rebuild in isolation, afraid to let anyone close enough to hurt them again. After lunch, as the work resumed, Victoria took a break from helping in the kitchen and walked down to the creek that ran through Mason's property. She needed a moment alone, away from the noise and bustle, to settle her racing thoughts. The water was crystal clear, running fast over smooth stones, and she could see trout holding steady in the current. She sat on a boulder near the bank and tried to calm her mind. "Are you all right?" She jumped at Mason's voice and turned to find him approaching, carrying 2 tin cups. "I am fine. Just needed a moment of quiet. I know the feeling." He handed her one of the cups. "I brought you some cider. You have been working hard all morning. So have you." Victoria took the cup gratefully. The cider was cool and sweet, perfect after the morning's labor. "The barn is really taking shape. You must be pleased." "I am overwhelmed," Mason admitted, sitting on another boulder near hers. "I never expected so many people to come, to give up their own work to help me. I'm not used to that kind of generosity." "Why not?" Victoria asked. "You showed me tremendous generosity when you found me on that trail. Why are you surprised when others do the same for you?" Mason looked out at the water, his jaw working as though he was trying to find the right words. "After I lost my family, I learned to rely only on myself. It was safer that way. If you do not depend on anyone, they cannot let you down. If you do not get close to anyone, it does not hurt when they leave or die. I have lived that way for a long time." "That sounds lonely," Victoria said softly. "It is." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes intense. "But then I found you on that trail, and something changed. I could not just ride past and leave you there, and when I brought you back to my cabin, when we sat at my table and talked, it was the first time in years that my house felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep. You were there for less than a day, but after you left, the silence was deafening." Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Mason." "I know it is fast," he said quickly. "I know we barely know each other, and you have your position with the Pattersons, and I have no right to say any of this, but I have to be honest with you. I think about you constantly. Every day I consider riding over to the Pattersons just to see you, even though I have no excuse to be there. I lie awake at night, remembering the way you felt in my arms on that ride home, the way you looked at my ranch as though it was something special, the way you trusted me even though you had every reason not to. I am falling in love with you, Victoria. I probably started falling the moment I saw you step out from behind that boulder, scared but defiant, refusing to give up even when you had every reason to, and I needed to tell you that, even if you do not feel the same way." Victoria set down her cup with shaking hands. Her whole body felt electrified, every nerve ending singing with joy and relief and desire. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I've been trying to tell myself it is impossible, that you cannot fall in love with someone in a day, but my heart will not listen to logic. I think about you all the time. I dream about you. When Thomas said you had asked about me, I was happier than I have been in weeks. I have been miserable without you, and I did not even realize how miserable until right now, sitting here with you again, feeling like I can finally breathe properly." Mason moved from his boulder to hers in one fluid motion, taking her face in his hands. "Can I kiss you?" "Please," Victoria breathed. And then his mouth was on hers and the world exploded into sensation. She had been kissed before by Charles during their engagement, chaste and proper kisses that had left her feeling nothing in particular. This was nothing like that. This was fire and hunger and desperate need. Mason kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning, like she was water, and he was dying of thirst. His hands were in her hair, dislodging pins, and her arms were around his neck, pulling him closer, and nothing had ever felt so right as this man's mouth on hers, his body pressed against her, his heart hammering as wildly as her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said roughly. "I know it is fast. I know it is crazy, but marry me anyway. I will spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy, making sure you never regret taking a chance on me. I will support your teaching. I will help you in any way I can. Just please say yes." Victoria pulled back just far enough to look into his eyes. What she saw there erased any lingering doubts. This man loved her, truly loved her, in a way Charles never had. He saw her, knew her, valued her, even with all her flaws and fears and broken pieces, and she loved him just as fiercely, just as completely. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise. When they finally walked back to the worksite hand in hand, everyone stopped what they were doing and stared. Sarah took one look at Victoria's disheveled hair and kissed swollen lips and burst into delighted laughter. "Finally!" she exclaimed. "I told you knowing happens fast. When is the wedding?" Mason looked at Victoria, raising an eyebrow in question. "How does next Saturday sound? That gives us a week to make arrangements. We can have the ceremony here if everyone will come back. I know it is asking a lot, but I do not want to wait any longer than necessary." "Neither do I," Victoria agreed, squeezing his hand. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the gathering. Everyone, it seemed, had noticed the attraction between Mason and Victoria, and everyone was delighted by the engagement. The barn raising turned into an impromptu engagement party, with someone producing a fiddle and others beginning to dance in the yard. Victoria found herself swept up in congratulations and well wishes from people who had been strangers just a few months ago but now felt like family. That evening, after everyone else had left, Victoria stood with Mason in front of his cabin watching the sun set behind the mountains. The barn was finished, or at least close enough that Mason could complete the remaining work on his own. But more importantly, Victoria's life had completely changed again, this time for the better. "Are you scared?" Mason asked, his arm around her waist. "Terrified," Victoria admitted, "but in a good way. When I stepped away from that wagon train, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything and would never find my way again. Instead, I found you." "We found each other," Mason corrected, "and I promise you I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this choice." "I know," Victoria said, leaning into his warmth. "I trust you completely." The week before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Victoria continued teaching the Patterson children during the day, but her evenings were spent preparing for her new life. Sarah and the other ranch wives rallied around her, helping her sew a wedding dress from fabric Thomas brought back from town. It was simple white muslin with blue ribbon trim, nothing fancy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Mason spent the week finishing work on his cabin, adding a second bedroom for future children, and installing proper curtains and other touches to make it feel more like a home. He rode to Placerville to file the marriage license and to purchase a simple gold ring that had belonged to a miner's widow who was selling her possessions to go back east. The ring felt like a talisman of luck to Mason, a symbol of his and Victoria's determination to build something lasting where others had failed. On Friday evening, Victoria moved her few possessions from the Patterson house to Mason's ranch. It did not take long since she still owned almost nothing, but Sarah insisted on contributing linens and dishes and various household items to help the young couple start their life together. Thomas gave them 2 good milk cows and a breeding pair of chickens. Other neighbors contributed preserves and flour and other staples to stock the pantry. By the time Victoria went to bed in the guest room on her last night as a single woman, she was overwhelmed by the generosity of this community that had embraced her so completely. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, unseasonably warm for early November. People began arriving at Mason's ranch by mid-morning, bringing food and flowers and good wishes. Someone had decorated the yard with pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers. Tables were set up for the celebration meal that would follow the ceremony. Children ran wild with excitement, and there was a festive atmosphere that made Victoria's heart swell with happiness. She dressed in the Patterson house, with Sarah helping her with the buttons of her wedding dress and arranging her hair. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, her eyes shining with tears. "Mason is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Victoria said. 6 weeks ago I had nothing and no one. Now I have all of this." "You always had this inside you," Sarah said firmly. "The courage, the strength, the capacity to love and be loved. You just needed the right circumstances to let it emerge. Now go marry that cowboy before he wears a hole in his yard from pacing." The ceremony was simple but moving. The traveling preacher who made a circuit of the ranch families in the area officiated, reading from his worn Bible and talking about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of building a life on mutual respect and love. Mason stood tall and proud, wearing his best clothes, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. When it came time to exchange vows, his voice was steady and clear, full of conviction. "I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life," Mason said. "I promise to build a home with you, to face whatever challenges come our way together, and to never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life. You are my partner, my equal, and my greatest blessing." Victoria's voice shook slightly as she made her own vows, but the words came straight from her heart. "I promise to love you, support you, encourage you, and stand by you in all circumstances. I promise to make a home with you, to share in your joys and your sorrows, and to never forget how lucky I am to have found you. You saved my life in more ways than one, and I will spend the rest of my days showing you what that means to me." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed her softly, reverently, as though she was something precious and fragile. Then the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and they were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations. The celebration that followed was one of the happiest days of Victoria's life. They ate and danced and laughed until the sun set and the stars came out. Someone built up a bonfire in the yard, and people sat around it telling stories and singing songs. Children fell asleep in their mother's arms, but the adults stayed late, reluctant to let the magic of the evening end. Finally, in the deep of night, the last guest departed, and Victoria and Mason were alone in their home. Their home, not just his or hers, but theirs together. The cabin felt different now, infused with new possibility and promise. Mason took her hand and led her to the bedroom he had prepared. He had put fresh linens on the bed and placed a vase of wildflowers on the small table by the window. Candles burned softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was simple but romantic, and Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at his thoughtfulness. "Are you happy?" Mason asked, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be, Zaitzi," Victoria said honestly. "I love you so much, Mason. I did not know I could feel this way about anyone." "I love you too," he said, and then he was kissing her, and the rest of the world fell away. That night they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and joy. Victoria had been nervous, not knowing quite what to expect, but Mason was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and cherished. By the time they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Victoria felt fundamentally changed, as though some final piece of herself had clicked into place. The months that followed were the happiest of Victoria's life. She continued teaching the children at the Patterson Ranch 3 days a week, riding over on Daisy and returning in the evenings. The other days she spent working alongside Mason on the ranch, learning to care for the animals and manage the property. It was hard physical work, but she found satisfaction in the tangible results of her labor and the knowledge that she was building something lasting. Winter came early and hard that year, with heavy snows that sometimes trapped them in the cabin for days at a time. But those enforced periods of isolation were cozy rather than lonely. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Victoria grading lessons or working on needlework while Mason repaired tack or whittled, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. They told each other stories from their pasts, shared their hopes and dreams for the future, debated philosophy and politics and religion. Victoria had never felt so intellectually and emotionally connected to another person. They also learned to navigate the small disagreements and adjustments that come with marriage. Victoria had to learn to live with Mason's tendency to work himself to exhaustion, his reluctance to ask for help even when he needed it. Mason had to learn to live with Victoria's need for order and routine, her occasional bouts of melancholy when memories of her father or her old life surfaced unexpectedly. But they faced these challenges together with patience and humor and deep love, and their bond only grew stronger. In early spring, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Mason, wanting to be sure. And when she finally shared the news one evening over dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with joy, and he swept her into his arms, holding her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. "We're going to have a baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be a family." "We already are a family," Victoria said, laughing and crying at the same time. "But yes, we are going to expand it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Victoria had to reduce her teaching schedule as summer approached, and the heat made travel more difficult. The Patterson children and their parents were understanding and excited for her. Sarah became an invaluable source of advice and support, having gone through the process 6 times herself. Mason became absurdly protective, constantly worrying that Victoria was overdoing it, trying to keep her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup. "I am pregnant, not broken," Victoria finally told him in exasperation when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of eggs. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I promise I will be fine." "I know," Mason said, looking sheepish. "I just cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you. You and this baby are everything to me." "Which is exactly why you need to trust me to know my own limits," Victoria said more gently. "I will ask for help when I need it, I promise, but I also need to keep living my life." Their son was born on a crisp October evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Victoria was certain she would not survive it. But Sarah was there coaching her through, and Mason held her hand the entire time, whispering encouragement and love. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Victoria felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly stopped her heart. "He is perfect," Mason whispered, cradling the tiny infant with the same careful reverence he had shown Victoria on their wedding night. "He looks like you." "He has your eyes," Victoria said, exhausted but happy. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Mason said, "What about James? It was my father's name. He would have loved to meet his grandson." "James Young," Victoria said, testing it out. "I like it. James Thomas Young, for your father and for Thomas Patterson, who has been such a good friend to us." The first year of James's life was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Victoria had to stop teaching temporarily to focus on caring for the baby, though she missed her students terribly. Mason hired a young man from one of the neighboring ranches to help with the heavy work so he could spend more time with his family. They took turns walking the floor with James when he cried at night, changed countless diapers, marveled at every small milestone. Victoria discovered that she loved being a mother almost as much as she loved teaching. There was something profound about nurturing this tiny person, watching him grow and change day by day, knowing that she and Mason were shaping who he would become. But she also found herself longing to return to the classroom, missing the intellectual stimulation and the satisfaction of watching students learn. When James was 18 months old, Victoria approached Sarah with a proposal. What if they built a proper schoolhouse on the Patterson property? And Victoria came back to teach full-time, bringing James with her. Sarah could watch the baby while Victoria taught, and it would give both women companionship during the long days. Sarah agreed immediately, delighted at the prospect, and the other ranch families enthusiastically supported the plan. That summer, Mason and Thomas and several other men built a small but sturdy schoolhouse on a corner of the Patterson ranch. It had a wood stove for winter, proper desks and chairs, a chalkboard, and shelves for books. Victoria cried when she first saw it, overwhelmed by the community's investment in education and in her dream. She resumed teaching that fall, and the school quickly became a central institution in the scattered ranch community. More families sent their children, some traveling over an hour each way to attend. Victoria taught students ranging from age 6 to 16, dividing them into groups by ability rather than age, and tailoring her lessons to each student's needs. She was in her element, doing what she was meant to do, and the children flourished under her instruction. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. When James was 3, Victoria gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret after Victoria's mother. 2 years after that came another son, Daniel. The cabin that had once felt spacious now bulged with the chaos of family life, and Mason added on 2 more rooms to accommodate their growing brood. Victoria continued teaching, bringing her children with her to school until they were old enough to be students themselves. Mason's ranch prospered as he proved to be a skilled cattleman and a fair dealer. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. They had built a life full of love and purpose, surrounded by friends and community, exactly what Victoria had longed for during those dark days in Ohio. On their 10th anniversary, they took a rare evening away from the children, leaving them with Sarah and Thomas, and rode out to the spot where Mason had first found Victoria. They stood together in the fading light, remembering that terrible, wonderful day that had changed both their lives. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not come along that day?" Mason asked, his arm around Victoria's waist. "Or if I had just ridden past?" "No," Victoria said firmly, "because I do not believe in coincidence. I think we were meant to find each other one way or another. Maybe not that exact way, maybe not on that exact trail, but somehow, somewhere we would have come together. This love feels too big, too important to be random chance." "I think you are right," Mason said, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria Young. These 10 years with you have been the happiest of my life. I cannot wait to see what the next 10 bring." "And the 10 after that? And the 10 after that?" Victoria said, tilting her face up for a proper kiss. "I love you, Mason. Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for taking me home." "Thank you for trusting me enough to come," Mason said. "Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for being my partner and my love." They stayed there until full darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms under a sky full of stars, 2 people who had lost everything and found each other, who had built something beautiful from the dust and the heartache. Their story had started with abandonment and fear, but it had become something far greater, a testament to the power of love, the importance of community, and the courage it takes to start over and trust again. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved learning and wanted to be a teacher like his mother. Margaret was wild and fearless, more comfortable on horseback than in the classroom, clearly taking after her father. Daniel was the charmer, with an easy smile and a way of getting into trouble that somehow always ended with him being forgiven. Victoria's school grew and thrived, eventually serving over 30 students from families scattered across a 50-mile radius. When James was 14, he began helping his mother teach the younger students, showing a natural aptitude for instruction. Margaret had no interest in teaching but became an invaluable help on the ranch, working alongside Mason with the cattle and horses. Daniel showed talent with music and mechanics, always tinkering with things, taking them apart to see how they worked. Mason and Victoria grew older together, their love deepening and maturing with each passing year. They had weathered hardships, droughts, and harsh winters and cattle diseases that threatened their livelihood. They had celebrated triumphs, like the year Mason's breeding program produced the finest horses in the county, or the year Victoria's students swept the academic competitions at the county fair. They had supported each other through sorrows, like when Sarah Patterson died suddenly of pneumonia, leaving Thomas a broken man, or when Victoria's mother passed away back in Pittsburgh, and Victoria grieved the relationship they had never quite rebuilt after her father's death. Through it all, they remained each other's anchor and refuge. Every night, no matter how busy or tired they were, they made time to talk, to share the day's events, to simply be together. Mason never stopped looking at Victoria with wonder, as though he could not quite believe his luck in finding her. Victoria never stopped feeling that spark of recognition when she caught sight of Mason across a room or a field, that sense of coming home that had hit her almost from the first moment. When their children grew up and started families of their own, James becoming a teacher in Denver, Margaret marrying a neighboring rancher's son and staying close to home, Daniel heading to San Francisco to work as an engineer, Mason and Victoria found themselves alone together again just as they had been in the early days. The cabin felt too quiet without the chaos of children, but it also felt peaceful, a place to rest after decades of hard work. They spent their later years in quiet contentment, still working the ranch though on a smaller scale, still involved in the community they had helped build. Victoria kept teaching until she was in her 60s, finally retiring when her eyesight began to fail, and standing for long hours became too difficult. The community threw her a retirement celebration that brought former students from across the state, now grown with children and even grandchildren of their own, all wanting to thank the teacher who had changed their lives. Mason lived to see his 80th birthday, still sharp-minded and independent, though his body had grown frail. On a warm spring morning, he did not wake up, passing peacefully in his sleep with Victoria at his side. She grieved him deeply, but with gratitude too, grateful for the 50-plus years they had shared, for the life they had built together, for the love that had sustained them both. Victoria lived another 5 years after Mason's death, spending her days surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, still sharp and full of stories about the old days. She told them about the wagon train that left her behind, about the cowboy who found her and took her home, about the way love can strike like lightning and change everything in a single moment. She died in her sleep on a cold January night, in the cabin that Mason had built with his own hands, the cabin where they had raised their family and built their life. Her last conscious thought was of that day by the creek when Mason had told her he was falling in love with her, when she had found the courage to admit she felt the same way. It had been the bravest thing she had ever done, saying yes to love, saying yes to risk, saying yes to building a life with a man she barely knew but trusted completely. And it had been the best decision of her entire life. The community buried her next to Mason on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the shadow of the mountains that had witnessed their entire story. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to mourn and remember, sharing stories of the remarkable couple who had built something lasting from nothing, who had loved fiercely and completely, who had shown by example what it meant to commit to each other and to community. The schoolhouse Victoria had taught in still stood, now named the Victoria Young School in her honor. The ranch that Mason had carved from wilderness still operated, run by Margaret's grandchildren. The love they had shared echoed through generations, a legacy more valuable than land or gold or silver. Their story had begun with dust and abandonment, with fear and uncertainty, but it had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. It was a story of courage and trust, of second chances and new beginnings, of finding home not in a place but in a person. It was a story that proved that sometimes getting lost is the first step to finding exactly where you belong, and that the worst day of your life can lead directly to the best thing that ever happened to you. Victoria had stepped away from a wagon train one September morning and found herself abandoned in the wilderness. But she had not been lost. Not really. She had been exactly where she needed to be at exactly the right moment to meet the man who would become her home, her partner, her great love. The wagon train had left her in the dust, but the cowboy had found her and taken her home, and together they had built a life worth living, a love worth remembering, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.